Welcome to this GCSE Science tutorial video on the human nervous system. For great GCSE Science content, be sure to subscribe and remember to check us out on TikTok, where we post GCSE Science videos daily. Living organisms need to respond to changes in their environment, otherwise they would not be able to survive. The human body is made up of billions of cells that are working together. Cells therefore need to communicate with each other. This is where the nervous system comes in. The human nervous system allows humans to react to their surroundings and coordinate their behaviours. And it works by using electrical impulses to bring about fast but short-lived responses. Here is a brief summary of how the human nervous system works. First of all, we have a stimulus. And this stimulus is detected by cells called receptors. Then the receptor transmits the message or the electrical impulse along a sensory neuron to the central nervous system. Then goes through the central nervous system to a motor neuron, then to an effector, and then finally we get a response. Let's now go into a little bit more detail. We're going to start with the stimuli and the receptors. The human body is sensitive to changes in the environment, known as stimuli. Specialized cells known as receptors are able to detect stimuli. Different sense organs have different receptors for different types of stimulus. For example, temperature, pressure, pain, light, chemical in the form of smell, and chemical in the form of tastes. And as for the receptors that detect these different stimuli, temperature, pressure and pain is detected by temperature, pressure and pain receptors, light by light receptors, and chemical stimuli by, you guessed it, chemical receptors. And the sense organs where these receptors are located are as follows. So temperature, pressure and pain receptors are in the skin, light receptors are going to be found in the eyes, and our chemical receptors for smell, they're in the nose, and for taste, they're on the tongue. Once the receptor cells have detected the stimuli, the information is sent as an electrical impulse that passes along specialized cells called neurons. Another word for a neuron is a nerve cell. From the receptors, the electrical impulse then moves along a type of neuron called a sensory neuron until it reaches the central nervous system, known as the CNS for short. The central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord, and its function is to gather information about the environment and also respond to changes in the environment. Therefore, the central nervous system sends impulses along neurons to the rest of the body, and it does this to bring about a response. So then, once the electrical impulse reaches the central nervous system, it then travels along a neuron called a motor neuron until it reaches what we call an effector. An effector is a part of the body, for example a muscle or a gland, that can respond to a stimulus. So what then are these responses of muscles and glands? Well, when receiving an electrical impulse from the central nervous system via a motor neuron, a muscle contracts and glands secrete hormones. Here we have a diagram that shows a motor neuron, and at the bottom there we have, and that's attached to an effector, which is muscle tissue. And now appearing, we can see a green arrow going downwards. That's the direction of the electrical impulse, and that causes the muscle tissue to contract. That's our response. Here is a specific example of how the central nervous system coordinates a response to a stimulus. So a boy is walking past a burger van, and the smell of the burgers is the stimulus. And this smell, the stimulus, is detected by receptors found in his nose. This information is then sent via an electrical impulse to the central nervous system via a sensory neuron. Remember, the central nervous system includes the brain, so this is where the boy makes a decision. Do I buy a burger? Yes or no? The central nervous system then sends an electrical impulse to his leg muscles, the effector, via motor neurons. This will then allow the boy to walk, that's the response, towards the counter of the burger van and buy a burger. Remember, this is an example of a coordinated response. We are now going to look at a response known as an automatic response, which is something very different. Automatic responses are called reflexes or reflex actions. Reflexes are automatic and rapid and do not require the conscious part of the brain. In other words, we respond without thinking. Reflexes control basic bodily functions such as breathing, blinking, and peristalsis. Peristalsis is the process of food moving through the digestive system. Other examples of reflexes that involve reacting to specific stimuli include lifting your hand off of a really hot surface or object, in this case a flame, lifting your hand off of a sharp object, for example a nail, and lastly we have pupils shrinking when light is too bright. We can therefore say that reflexes are very useful in that they help reduce the chance of injury. So then without reflexes we'd be more likely to burn ourselves, cut ourselves, or in the case of our last example there, damage our eyes due to excess light. This brings us on to reflex arcs. It is actually a reflex arc that reduces the severity of an injury. A reflex arc is a nerve pathway that bypasses the conscious part of the brain in order to decrease the time between the stimulus and the reflex action. Reflex arcs involve all three neurons: sensory neurons, relay neurons, and motor neurons. We have already discussed sensory neurons, located between the receptors in the sense organs and the central nervous system, and motor neurons found between the central nervous system and the effector. Remember, the effector is either a muscle or a gland. However, we are yet to discuss the third neuron, the relay neuron, and this connects a sensory neuron to a motor neuron and is found in the central nervous system. Appearing on your screen now is an example of a reflex arc for when a doctor tests a person's knee-jerk reflex. Most of us have had this done at some point. If a person has an overactive or underactive knee-jerk reflex, it could be a sign of a more serious problem with the nervous system. So let's describe this reflex arc step by step. First step then is where the doctor taps the patient just below the knee with a small hammer. Step 2, pressure receptors in the quadriceps muscle detects this stimulus. Step 3, the pressure receptors generate an electrical impulse and it moves along the sensory neuron, which is here in red. This electrical signal moves towards a relay neuron in the central nervous system, in this case the spinal cord. That is step 4. Now moving on to step 5, where the impulse then travels along the motor neuron, coloured blue, until it reaches the quadriceps muscle, the effector. And lastly we have the response, step 7, and this is where the quadricep muscle contracts and the patient's leg moves outwards. There's quite a lot of information here, so feel free to pause the video now and make any additional notes and maybe reread over the different steps of this reflex arc. It is a distinct possibility you could be asked a 6-mark question having to describe a reflex arc in the exam or fill in different sections of a reflex arc. Now, the video so far may have led you to think that neurons are connected directly to one another. This is actually not true. There are actually gaps between each neuron called synapses, seen here. Here's the definition then. Synapses are junctions or connections between neurons. The electrical impulses that travel along a neuron cannot cross the synapse. Instead, chemicals called neurotransmitters are released at the end of the first neuron, seen here, where I'm just going to draw a red arrow. The neurotransmitters then diffuse across the synapse and bind to receptors located on the second neuron, like this one here at the bottom. This then leads to a new electrical impulse travelling along the second neuron and so on around the body. We can see here another red arrow is going to appear going to the right. That's the electrical impulse. Well, that's the end of this video on the human nervous system. Thank you once again for choosing Genius Science. Remember to work hard, be kind to others, and we'll see you in the next video.